book discussion, The Science of Can and Can't by Chiara Marletto. This is a series. This is the first episode of this series, and I'm going to try to apply her book and the epistemology of Chiara and David Deutsch to the hedge fund business. So I want to differentiate from Brad Hall's podcast, who also has a series on this book, and just offer a little bit more practical context into business, hedge fund business, finance, and the generation of knowledge with the purpose of generating wealth. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's May 25th, 2021. This is Krim Delco. Since the last update, we are up 3.6%. The market is up roughly 80 basis points for the year. We are down 16%. The market is up 10.5%. We're underperforming by 26.5%. Chiara Marletto has published her book, The Science of Can and Can't. Brett Hall has started a series, and needless to say, I'm very inspired by both of them. And I also want to start my own series. And just to differentiate myself from Brett, my conversation will be hopefully a little bit more applied and very focused on the wealth generation part of life. Versus Brad's, I think, is more general, and he's also trying to be comprehensive with the book. I'm just going to skip a lot of things and just try to pick what's important. So in chapter 1, Chiara starts with a few definitions, and I think they're important. And there I might overlap with Brad, but that's fine. I think we need to set the base, the lay of the land here. So Chiara talks about the no design rules, which she defines as the fact that the laws of physics determine certain fundamental laws. That's why they're the laws of physics. So, for example, they govern how elementary forces and elementary particles behave. However, the laws of physics don't have implicitly written in them any kind of design. So the laws of physics don't determine that we have something like a Tesla car, a Rolex watch, a volcano, a planet. None of that. All of that stuff has come out of the laws of physics under the no design rule. So this is important for this book. Further on, Chiara talks that knowledge is information that has the property to keep instantiating itself in physical substrates. So this is a handful maybe, but the difference between information and knowledge is that information can be all kinds of information. So for example, you can have certain, let's say, DNA strands that encode information, and then whatever living organism comes out of that new DNA strand dies, and therefore that is just information lost, and that's not knowledge. Knowledge is information that has the property to keep instantiating itself. So, for example, DNA is knowledge, and she talks about that also in the context of David Deutsch and the fabric of reality, and in the beginning of Infinity, Deutsch talks about the natural selection as a process to proliferate knowledge, genetic knowledge, for example, which is different than the knowledge that we humans have, the explanatory knowledge. And here's a very important thing: resilience, which is the ability to survive. So again, we have elementary particles, elementary laws, dynamics of particles, how they behave, and then we have the laws of physics just propagating those particles, and then resilience is when we have knowledge to keep ourselves alive, or keep if let's say a volcano or a star is formed, that is resilience. Over billions of years, that star can maintain itself through the interaction of all the atoms and all the elementary particles and the laws of physics. Important for Chiara, again, the definition of knowledge, which is basically resilience plus information equals knowledge. So you have information and then resilience, or the ability to propagate itself through physical systems over time and not die. That is knowledge. I think that's one of the key aspects. Now, explanatory knowledge as well as natural selection, so biological knowledge, both need variation and variation in natural selection and in explanatory knowledge of humans, for example, or bacteria or whatever, but particularly humans. Criticism takes the act of variation. Criticism is the act of seeking errors in an attempt to improve solutions. So now if we jump forward from the Big Bang to humans, and those humans somehow came to existence, And now we have this ability to criticize our knowledge and improve it by seeking errors. So this is one of the key aspects of David Deutsch's philosophy, which is based on Popper, of course. And I think we want to keep that in mind. Design is an illusion. Design doesn't actually happen. Design comes out of the Big Bang. And there's a fundamental passage in Chiara's book where she says that if we found, imagine if you design the computer in a way that can only hold very specific parts of memory. So you say the factory where the computer was made in a factory, and in the factory there was only a very specific way that memory can be stored. If we now replace factory with Big Bang, which is the same thing, it's just the time scale would be different. So the Big Bang has made sure that there's only one specific way that memory can be stored, then the computer would be useless. But we don't. We have a universal computer under Turing and the theory of information. We have universal computers. So what Deutsch and Chiara are saying is that we have the ability to, because the laws of physics don't prohibit us to have general intelligence, to have general universal intelligence and general universal explanatory knowledge seeking. The laws of physics don't prevent us from doing that. And this is one of the key takeaways from David Deutsch and Chiara. And I think this is the key also for me why we have David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, as part of our principal stack at Orange Capital Partners. And it's very likely that we're going to have Chiara's book also. But again, I haven't even finished the book. I'm still in chapter 1, and I'm already very excited. So I think it's very likely that we're going to have Chiara's book in our principal stack. Natural selection is non-purposeful. Okay, it's a non-purposeful process. There is no purpose behind natural selection, but for some reason, every now and then things pop up that have resilience. Knowledge is created and things propagate itself through physical systems and sometimes survive billions of years, such as DNA, for example, and life as we know it on Earth. So this is the key takeaway from chapter 1. And I want to now make actually add one more thing, which is the counterfactual. The counterfactual is the fundamental key aspect of Chiara's philosophy. And what she's trying to say here is that in traditional physics and science, we are deterministic in a way that we say we have a certain set of initial conditions, and we have a certain set of laws of dynamics or momentum. And once we know the initial conditions and we use our laws of either Newton's laws or the quantum electromechanics or whatever law we have that determines the propagation of the system, then we will say what's going to happen. And this is sort of the key aspect of physics and the predictive power of physics, because if we have a set of initial conditions, we can predict what's going to happen. And this is why we are able to build computers, and this is why we're able to build the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, what Chiara is adding is the counterfactuals. She's saying that physical systems are not just defined by the things which are going to happen, but by all the things which are possible. And the only thing which we should regard as not important is the things that are impossible according to the laws of physics. This is the fundamental key statement of Chiara's book. And here is a nice anecdote that she offers to illustrate that. Imagine there's a writer in Scotland, a contemporary writer, and let's call him Mr. X. Mr. X is in his book, in his house on this island somewhere in Scotland, and he has determined that he will have a stack of white papers and a pen, and he will write down ideas if they come to him. And now let's imagine that writer spends 5 years on that Scottish island, and he never writes down anything because he has no ideas. And that is something, according to Chiara, which we could predict according to the laws of physics and the initial conditions and all of that stuff. We could predict that, let's say, we could maybe, if we were a Laplacian demon, we could see that that person just doesn't have the creativity, which is sort of the threshold that would take him to write down something. That person's just not creative. So we could predict that. But what Chiara says is what's key is, and now let's assume 1,000 years from now, archaeologists find that stack of paper and the fossils of Mr. X, and they say, okay, and now because we're 1,000 years hence, we also have the technology to predict that obviously this person was not intelligent enough to write down something. So this is it. This is end of story. Now, the point that Chiara is making is what's really important here is not that there is that person, Mr. X, who was a poet, and that there's a stack of paper, that there's a stack of papers that is empty, and that we can predict that it's empty. What is really key, according to Chiara, is that that stack of paper was there in the first place, and there was a potential that something could have been written down. And that's something that our current way of doing science and physics in particular, but science in general, doesn't apply. That doesn't take that into account. The fact that counterfactual, that it could have been that for some reason, for some variation, whatever, he could have had this blitz of idea. Maybe something could have happened, some random thing, and he could have written down something, and that something could have become a verse, and that verse could have impacted some king, and the king would have started a war, and then blah, blah, blah. So the point here is that the potential, the potentiality, or the optionality, as we use that word in financial markets often, is key. And now I want to make the arc to financial markets here, try to sort of close this first chapter discussion with an application to financial markets. And it's really interesting today, in the morning meeting, we spoke about, me and my partner, we spoke about philosophy, and is philosophy useful? And I said, look, it's very useful for many things. Yeah, philosophy is kind of like a map. It's kind of like Google Maps. Is Google Maps useful? Well, it's enormously useful for you to find your way around the world. But other than that, it has no purpose. I mean, you're not going to be happier or less happy or make money or not make money because of Google Maps. And I think philosophy is the Google Maps for the mind. It gives you a sense for where you are, where you should go, and why you're going, where you're going. And I think this is a very good example of, like, we talk so much about, let's say, what's the valuation of Tesla, what's the valuation of the CRISPR stocks, which is our portfolio, and many other investors talk about their own portfolios, particularly the venture capital community in Silicon Valley is often obsessed with valuation and things like that. And I think Mark Andreessen once said it very well. He said, as far as I'm concerned at this point, I would regard any idea that comes to me as viable, because sooner or later it will happen. It's just a question of timing. And I think what Andreessen is saying here is exactly what Chiara is saying. And this is, I think, the punchline here for chapter 1, which is counterfactuals actually are the key for investing. And nobody in the investment community talks about them. Because counterfactuals, or as I used to be an options trader, so I have a bit more sense for that, or we call it real options, or the optionality of a company, or the potential that a company has outside of what's predictable. So Tesla, for example, could become a crypto company because what it has in place is sort of a universal way to acquire knowledge and proliferate itself through products and services into more wealth generation. It has that potential, much more than General Mills or Coca-Cola. And that's the key. That's why Tesla is such an exciting company. And while we all kind of know it when we see it, we don't have a language to really describe these things. And I think Chiara is offering us that language. We can say that Tesla is a physical instantiation of knowledge, which has started probably 30, 40 years ago with lithium-ion batteries and other technologies such as of course, inverters and then solar power and all that stuff, and then has continued on that path. But what Tesla is really also doing is creating a little bit like that poet in Scotland, the Mr. X. It has a lot more counterfactuals, a lot more potential to do things that maybe are not deterministically predictable right now, but just because it's there, just because Elon Musk is there and he's hired certain people and they have certain knowledge, and because he's running SpaceX also, there is this potential that things could happen that are very, very exciting and could create enormous amounts of wealth. I think one of those is artificial intelligence. We cannot fathom our way around the fact that Tesla will solve self-driving, but we as investors, somehow we feel that it could happen just because it's Tesla, because the way they do things is they follow these counterfactuals, and they build many, many counterfactuals on top of each other. They compound them, and then the more counterfactuals you compound on top of themselves, there is more potential that something could happen. Maybe it could happen very differently, but it could happen. And this is the exciting thing. I still have trouble putting it in words that I could present at a conventional Wall Street investment conference. I think people would look at me, if I spoke about counterfactuals, like I'm a little bit like a renegade hippie, which is fine. They look at me anyway that way. My point here being is that I find it very important that we start finding a language for investing in high potential companies with lots and lots of optionality. And I think we need better words than optionality and potential, because those words have been misused. And I think I want to use Chiara's book and The Science of Can and Can't and try to bridge the gap between, try to bridge from her aspect, which is more physics and science driven, towards business and wealth generation, because it's the same kind of problem. The question of how is knowledge being created and how is knowledge proliferating itself? How is knowledge being tested? How is knowledge being validated through validation or criticism? And how is knowledge being made more robust in terms of being more resilient? Those are the same questions that Chiara asks for physics, or I think she will ask it for other disciplines also in further chapters. And I want to ask the question specifically for wealth generation. And I think in wealth generation, we have the same idea. We have an initial condition. We have an entrepreneur with money starting a business with certain co-founders. Those are the things, let's say, that lots of VCs are obsessed about, and rightly so. What are the initial conditions? They just don't talk like that. So, well, who are the founders? What's their experience and stuff like that? But those are the initial conditions. What's the market? How's the market look like? And now we go on, and instead of doing all these analysis like a lot of analysts do, where we look at markets and then we think, okay, this is the market, this is how it's going to grow, this market's going to grow. We try to put counterfactuals in this place. We try to incorporate them much more in the valuation of the company or the assessment of the company. And I think this would be a very useful way to think about companies' valuation and the potential for wealth generation going forward. Thank you.